This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Deirdre Cooper Owens, who teaches in the Department of History with an appointment in the Africana Studies Institute at the University of Connecticut. In addition to a number of scholarly and public scholarship writings, Cooper Owens is the author of the immensely important book Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, published by University of Georgia Press in 2018. In this conversation, we explore the meaning of Black studies from the perspective of race and gender history and historical writing, the questions of sources and source material for such writing, and how the study of Black life speaks to the future of intellectual and cultural life in a time of political crisis. Hello, Deirdre. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really glad you made time to talk with us today. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I am doing well.
I look forward to talking to you because I think your research is really interesting. I'm very curious to hear about how you think about the relationship between your field of primary disciplinary field of history and your current joint appointment in Africana Studies at University of Connecticut. But I also wanted to say ahead of time, I really love your work. I think it's incredibly important and urgent. And, you know, seeing that you have that affiliation or joint appointment in Africana Studies as someone who's invested in this field of Black studies, I was really happy to see that. I think getting your research into Black studies is going to be absolutely fantastic for our field. And so,
Thank you.
Having a chance to talk to you about the way you imagine and think about some of these things is just really interesting and exciting. So I extra appreciate you making the time.
Thank you so much.
It's also the summer, and so I appreciate people taking summertime to do it.
You know, I had a little jaunt to Tulum, so I have come back well rested and restored. So, you know, it makes summer easier when you had those opportunities.
I tried to erase that from my mind because I really need a vacation. And when you emailed me and said you were back from Tulum, I was like, oh, okay, I just ignore that. I'm very jealous. But before I get into asking you sort of your thoughts on the field of Black studies, I wanted to ask a question that I think is really about narrating your personal intellectual journey around this question. Really, what is it that drew you to the study of Black life and in the particular ways that you do, and what sustains that kind of work?
Oh, that's a really great question. What drew me to the study of Black life and Black people and Black culture? You know, it started when I was young. My mother is a history buff, but I think before I even knew that there was a thing called Black studies or Africana studies, I grew up in Washington, D.C. As a child. And so it was then Chocolate City. That's what it was called, you know. And so every person who was in a leadership position and those who kind of held the lowliest positions were Black people. And so my father working at the National Archives, my mother being this kind of history buff and being very into like the community, I was going to museums and book fairs and readings. And, you know, my parents even had a co-op membership in the Nation of Islam when they had like a little grocery store in Anacostia. So I think being, you know, socialized in that environment planted seeds. And I also come from a family that is filled with HBCU graduates in South Carolina. And so by the time I was in high school in the Low Country in South Carolina, I knew I wanted to be amongst Black people in an environment where we could learn and grow. So I chose to go to a HBCU and major in mass comm because I thought I wanted to be Oprah Winfrey. I graduated in 1990. So almost every Black woman I knew, Black girl, I should say, back there wanted to be Oprah. And so I just figured, oh, here's a Black woman with the studio who talks to really interesting people. I wanted to do the same thing, but I wanted to do a kind of, and I would have people Google this guy, Lister Velt Middleton, had a show called For the People. And he interviewed, very much like what you're doing, Black people in Black studies in every field. And it was a part of South Carolina ETV. And I grew up watching that show, and I thought, oh, I could be like the female version of Listervelt Middleton and have a For the People show. And then, like every young person, you do your internships, and I discovered that TV was not for me. And so I worked a few years, still going to Black bookstores, buying books, blah, blah, blah. Decided I wanted to get a master's degree in African American Studies. And so I applied to a few schools, got into Clark Atlanta and HBCU, and my life changed in 1997 when I arrived there as a student. And so here was my opportunity to be able to study Black people and Black life and Black history. And I took classes from prominent Africana Studies scholars, Danny Black, who just made the news, who gave the Clark Atlanta graduation speech. He was our professor. He taught the intro class to Africana Studies. So it was an environment that was really rich with the possibilities of what the field held. And I worked in a number of Black museums there, even writing a thesis on that. So I thought that's the career path I would go into. But there was something about history in particular that called me. So I applied to PhD programs, got into UCLA, and decided to, eventually settle on enslaved women in the history of gynecology. But it was really, I think, growing up in the 1970s and 80s as a young child in DC, and then later going to HBCUs, going to a Black high school, being taught by Black educators, that inculcated the seeds for what becomes, in my world, Africana Studies or Black studies. That's always been foundational, I think, to my work as a historian.
So this is really interesting. I mean, we've done, I think a dozen or more of these podcast conversations, and this question that we start with, Ashley and I start with, it's incredible to me and like really noteworthy how many people will narrate their way into this concern through not direct instruction, but through sort of atmospheric or ambient things. You mentioned DC, I just think about driving around DC and everything, parks with statues and names of high schools and streets. That ambient presence is as much as any direct instruction, and people will tell that about like books on their bookshelves or things they saw on TV and the way these animate concerns, rather than, I think maybe what I expected, and I can't speak for Ashley, which was maybe more of somebody introduced me to these books and I got intrigued, but it's really the ambient part. It's that. Yeah. I find that really fascinating.
Yeah. And it's the thing where, of course, now in academia, you have these words where essentially I'm talking about my positionality, right? Which is so central to Black studies. But before you understand your positionality as a formally trained intellectual, I think it is the positionality of being for me, I was in a Black world. And so although I was very clear about race and racism and race relations, until I was 30, I was only dealing with Black people in Black environments. And so, my thinking had to have come from my affiliation and my socialization and my acculturation, in those Black communities. And understanding the world from that position. And so even as I think back on it now as someone who is very, very solidly middle-aged, I think about it's always been about how the environment has shaped me. So it's never been about one book or some professor, introducing me to something, because I had Black people who had been trained by other Black people teaching me since I was 5. Until I was 29, 30 years at Clark Atlanta University. And so I had just, there was never an introduction. It just kind of always was a part of the atmosphere, the environment. Yeah.
That kind of organicity of intellectual life is I think it's maybe it's a place for memoir, but it's also such a rich way of thinking about knowledge production.
Yeah.
It's there's a whole knowledge already at work at the moment you become formally an like acquirer of knowledge. Right? I mean, that's a strangely transactional idea of education, but you know what I mean.
No, but I mean, Toni Morrison, and I would look at her interviews when I was in grad school, on YouTube, but she talks about that, right? Mm-hmm. That it's, like you said, it's not just this kind of like, oh, I had this high school teacher or this professor who introduced me to this thing, but it was the community that she grew up in and having these conversations with her father, that were deeply intellectual, even if it wasn't in this kind of formal educational environment, that really influenced and impacted the way that she would move in the world as a thinker, as a writer, as a mother, as a teacher, all of those things, a book editor. Yeah.
Let me ask you a little bit about your imagination of the field of Black studies. The origins of the field are it has two elements. I don't want to call them contradictions, but I think there's always been a tension about at the origin of the field, because the field originates, of course, through student and community activism, right? A demand for recognition, presence, and institutionalization of the field of Black studies, or creation of the field of Black studies and Black studies departments, starting at San Francisco State and across the country. And it still remains in part that, a lot of places either become programs, become departments, or expand as departments because of activism and political demands. But it's also part of those demands came from the desire to recognize and create a space for the exploration of the Black intellectual tradition, which is a way of appreciating the historical, the story of Black people in the Atlantic world and beyond, expressive culture and politics and thinking and so forth. And so it's created for me this interesting double origin, right, of political activism, which is very community connected, and then a commitment to intellectual life and the history of ideas and the development of that. And I wonder about, when you think about Black studies as a field, how you think about that relationship. Like, how do you imagine it in relation to both community and activism, but also the pursuit of ideas and the development and deepening of intellectual traditions?
Ooh, that's a great question. I mean, I think Black studies cannot be disentangled from its community origins. I mean, it just can't. It's the kind of intellectual point of origin, right, for Black studies programs here and abroad. And there is something that is really beautiful about the reactionary response of the creation of Black studies, because ultimately, when you think about that, the kind of Black intellectual experience, it was really in response to people saying Black folk had no history, right? That they were simplistic and not intellectual beings. And so here you had these men and women from the 19th century. I'm being very U.S. centric here because that's what I'm schooled in. But, from the 19th century in this country, who are compiling and chronicling and writing histories from a Drusilla Dungy to J.A. Rogers, and then later, the John Henry Clarks and Nathan, Hare, may he rest in peace, who recently passed. All of these people, Dr. Ben, my goodness. And so there's something I think that is important, that I don't think any of those people that I named had PhDs, right? Some of them were not formally educated. And so the community, created these organic intellectuals who wanted to formalize education and not take it outside of the community. So yeah, it could sit in a San Francisco State. It can sit in Harvard University or those kinds of spaces. But at the same time, you had the community that was always involved. I think it is sometimes disappointing for me to see the ways that the kind of formalization of Black studies in certain spaces has tried to remove itself from the activists. or at least the kind of radical and reactionary activists. That has been disappointing. But, it's still a field that at the heart of it is interdisciplinary, and interdisciplinarity is really about the commingling, right, of disparate parts. And so that's the beauty of Black studies. And there's something that's dynamic about that. It's never going to be static.
And I have to say, I mean, when you say these major people in the history of, just keep it in the U.S., these major figures in the African American intellectual tradition, and this idea of who is an intellectual is so interesting. I'll never forget, I've mentioned this in a previous podcast, sitting in teaching a seminar on James Baldwin a couple of years ago, and a student asked me where he got his MFA. And I was like, he didn't go to college. And their complete disbelief. I mean, they loved it in many ways because it added to the sort of myth of James Baldwin. And they said, who else didn't go to college? And I said, what's interesting, until a very recent time in our history,
that's right,
who did go to college is a much more answerable question.
That's right.
Du Bois ends up being the sort of Shakespeare of the Black intellectual tradition because of his massive production. His Harvard education is bigger than life sort of presence and personality, but is not exemplary of the sort of Richard Wright and James Baldwin, just to take that particular era. And then it's also interesting for me thinking about political activism. And as you said, I like the way you concluded your comment, saying like interdisciplinary means commingling these sometimes activism and say expressive culture or the history of ideas. We're actually back at a point, as you know, where teaching the books themselves is a kind of political activism in a lot of spaces. And so I wrote this question, not really thinking about how, you're in Connecticut, I'm in Maryland, it's a different environment. But if we were writing this from Florida or from Texas, for example, that question of political activism or the history of ideas, those things have come back together in really troubling ways.
They have. Yeah. It's so interesting that for those who are, they would describe themselves as conservative, white Christian nationalist. They believe in a traditional America that espouses values that are much more rooted to the 1950s, that they are replicating a McCarthyism, right? And it's, this kind of intellectual attack against, largely it's always, it's always Black people and Black people's ideas and Black people's writings, at the heart of the attacks. And so that for me is not surprising at all. But what is sad is that the idea that ideas, concepts, that we aren't saying, there's nobody who says this is 100%, the truth, right? Nobody has taken that philosophical stance, but it's like, at least let me introduce you to these ideas to have you think in more sophisticated and nuanced ways about how to assess the world in which you live, that things don't just happen in a vacuum, right? That there is, as we were talking about, these kind of intellectual points of origin, right? I mean, everything has a creation story or a point of origin story. And that the very idea of that vexes these people so much that you now ban books, that you ban concepts, that when many of them who sit on the kind of oppositional political side that I do, when you ask them to define what is intersectionality, what is wokeness, they can't articulate it. And so I'm like, how are you fighting against something that you haven't been able to articulate? And even when you articulate it and it's wrong, because there's a source that, that can corroborate whether you're right or wrong.
Exactly.
Right. They will still tell you, well, I don't care. It presents a problem. And I was reading, in preparation for our conversation, I was reading a New Yorker article that Keeanga Yamada Taylor wrote, and she interviewed Robin Kelly. And Robin Kelly talked about this very same thing. And he's like, it's interesting. So you don't ban the books written by people who were virulently anti-Black. So, for instance, Thomas Jefferson in Notes on the State of Virginia. I talk about this in my own work, where he has these queries that literally say Black women chose to sexually mate with orangutans rather than Black men, right? Because of their animalistic sexual drives and over active libidos. They would not ban those books or books by all of the 18th and 19th century racial scientists. But you'll ban a novel by Toni Morrison. You'll literally ban a concept of intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, where she's basing it on the judgment, right, of a case. Like, this isn't something she's conjuring up. Like, these are things that actually happened. And that is scarier than people who were actually virulently anti-Black and misogynistic and all of those other things. It's incredible to me. I do believe the tide is going to turn. But we're just in that moment of a kind of McCarthyism again. Yeah. And so once again, it is more important for us to educate people and to be able to articulate in ways that heightens their analysis and strengthens their critical thinking.
It's been amazing to be in higher ed and have heard for decades about how teaching reflection is pointless and worthless, and then all of a sudden it's the most dangerous thing on earth. It's like, well, which is it? It's neither. It's kind of in between there, but yeah. Well, let me ask you about your own work in relation to Black studies. You work at that. With that deep investment in the history of gender, embodiment, medicine, and it really generates so many important insights for the study of Black life. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious how you think, because you're an historian by training, and in your disciplinary orientation, how do you see that the kind of work that you do in relation to the history of Black studies or the idea of the field, but also where does it push us? What new directions do you think it pushes us?
So, I think this is the important thing, right? So yes, I do have a PhD in history. But my initial training was in African American studies, in terms of my first graduate degree. And I got that training in the 1990s from an HBCU when everybody was trying to figure out the value of Afrocentricity versus multiculturalism, right? So it was these kind of cultural wars within Black studies, and how does the school of Asante see itself against the school of Henry Louis Gates, right? Or Skip Gates. Yeah. So that actually informed, I think, the way that I went about doing my scholarship and my research. Mm-hmm. So for instance, in many ways, I would not characterize myself as like 100% Afrocentrist. But there were certain things that I could take from that. So for instance, I wasn't involved with the objectivity question in history, for instance, because that was my specific field. I wasn't necessarily as involved with trying to understand man versus object, or man seeing himself in comparison to object. And it was really the kind of Afrocentric view in the ways I was taught was, how does man see himself? And I'm using the language and the gender that people would have used in the 1990s when I was in grad school then, but, to another person, to the environment. And I remember also having this foundational conversation with my professors at Clark Atlanta, Dr. David, I'm going to do this, Brian, because he was my husband. I'm calling him. Sure. Dr. Dorsey. I was having a middle-aged moment. Dr. David Dorsey, may he rest in peace. And then also Daniel Black, where they talked about, these either-or frameworks that could push you into a kind of absolutism that that doesn't allow for your work to be capacious intellectually. And so they taught us about, instead of either or, both and, like, how do you think about ideas and people and situations and context using a both and framework? And so those two things have always set, I think, at the foundation of how I see my work. So when I decided by my third year at UCLA to write a dissertation on enslaved women, and the slave-owning physicians who owned them, and how that relationship developed the modern fields of obstetrics and gynecology, I think those were always in the back of my mind. And so it was a very different way of viewing the history of medicine, which had always been about disease, great men or great women, and institutions. So you either wrote about hospitals, you wrote about the disease, or you wrote about the great men or great women. So Florence Nightingale or, Dr. James Marion Sims. And so for me, it was, well, how do I think about this perspective of American history? And I just kind of pivot. And instead of the doctors being the central historical agents, what about the patients? Mm-hmm. How do I think about slavery in the development of this? What does this mean? And then the activist part of me, I couldn't say this then because I needed to get a job and we still live in a capitalistic society. But I remember, I remember having these conversations with friends and my husband and saying, if somebody just read my book when I graduated, and they could use it as a case example for reparations, that would be great. I thought about those kinds of things. Like, it wasn't creating knowledge for knowledge's sake, but also politically, how could my work be used to at least have people assess the kind of medical racism and anti-Blackness in medical racism and how it's created these health disparities? At least my work could be a historical example of the kinds of duplicitous and criminal ways that anti-Blackness has been so entrenched in these structures. So that was also, the kind of community political mode of thinking that I had while also doing my research that I was just too afraid to say until the book came out. Right.
Well, I love the way you put that. That's so interesting. It's I think a really important way to think about the kind of historical scholarship that you're doing and so many people are doing about if you want to build a case for reparations, these are the kinds of things that hit really deep in our moral core. And we have to figure out how to respond to them. That's fantastic. I'm glad I asked the question. I'm super interested. It kind of makes me reframe your book, actually. Not reframe your book, but sort of it resonates a little bit differently on that. So thank you for that. I'm gonna try to ask the next question rather than go write down some notes.
Okay. No, thank you. But at the heart of it is, those are the seeds of Black studies that I think can, when people are sometimes like, I don't understand, what's the, is this just a rehashing of historical trivia? Or, because people outside of academia sometimes I think have a hard time of defining and explaining what Black studies is because they just think it's something that's historical, and it is in many ways, but for me it was having that interdisciplinary training in African American studies initially that helped me also reframe the ways that I would approach historical methods, and I think that's important.
So maybe that's already a good part of the answer to the next question I had for you. That you have companion appointments in Africana Studies and History at UConn, and so I was interested in how you think this arrangement, which I know is it's a fresh appointment for you from your previous work at University of Nebraska. Yeah. But I'm curious how you think about that involvement in Africana Studies as a professional, and in this case, mid-career. You already identified yourself as middle-aged. I think that's something to be proud of. Some people are ashamed of it.
No,
we have more money. We can travel more comfortably.
Let me tell you what, because baby, recycling cans was not it. When I was in grad school, I need that to be Black history for real. So.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. So in defense of middle age, recycling cans.
For real. That my husband and I did it in grad school. I promise you. And when I was in my PhD program, that was the dark side of the poverty that we experienced. But yes.
Yeah. So I'm curious in terms of your research, but also the way you teach and think, how what kind of impact this, being back in, since you had done your master's degree in this and obviously animated your doctorate and your work at the University of Nebraska, but now formally being in an Africana Studies department, how for you it impacts both your research, but also teaching and thinking?
This is interesting. I was on research leave for a year. So I've not taught formally, but I wanted to be involved and engaged in my community for ASI at UConn is what we call an Africana Studies Institute. So we're not a department yet, but we are an institute that still comes out of that same tradition that we spoke about earlier. And so I attended faculty meetings, I attended workshops, and this is a really interesting thing. We have a Black woman political scientist, Evelyn Simeon, who is was interim director, now the director of our institute. And one of the first things that she did was to have a workshop where she dealt with the work-life balance and how we as professors in Africana Studies, how we were thinking about ourselves in the context of a post-George Floyd world and the attacks on academia, on our field. And so she brought in someone who essentially, someone outside of the academy, but brought in someone to have us have these kind of community conversations and workshops to help us work through a lot of what was going on in the world. I had never experienced that in traditional history programs. So it was really wonderful to be able to have someone who was committed to a kind of community activist, holistic treatment of us as scholars, not just about the scholarly production, but how are the bodies, producing this work, living and being. And so that is wonderful. The other thing is, this was the first time that I had students, undergraduate students, not grad students, but undergraduate students, largely Black women, just Google me and, look on the website and say, hey, can you meet with our group? Hey, can I meet with you? Can we Zoom? Or can we have coffee or tea? I know you're on leave, but freshmen, sophomore, juniors, seniors, and they just wanted to be able to meet and speak with me or have me meet with their group. And that kind of reinvigorated, like, gosh, I've been missing this because I did not have that engagement at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I think for many of the grad students there and undergrads, they just didn't know how do we deal with this Black woman who is directing a medical humanities program, and how do we deal with this Black woman who has this endowed professorship? And so I didn't have any grad students there. There was no engagement. I only taught one grad course, and so there's something about being in Africana Studies Institute that feels like I've returned home intellectually. And that is a good feeling, And so the classes and those kinds of things that I've been doing for a while, that's kind of second nature to me. But there's still something about feeling like you are a part of the community and that your presence has value and worth. That's important. And so I felt that even without kind of being in the formal space of the classroom over the past year.
I love that. I'm so happy that's been it's beautiful, can be exhausting, but it's animated by all the things that we do as intellectuals and as teachers, which is that sense of connection and rather than disconnection, trying to sort of do your research, as you sort of indicated there about Nebraska. Let me ask you, it's in some ways related to the previous question I had about the history of Black studies and your own work. But this is a sort of more broad speculative question. We're in the sixth decade of this field being institutionalized. And what do you think, looking at the past of Black studies, that you think it's done particularly well, but also what you think it has not done particularly well?
I'll answer the second part first, because I'm always a glass half full kind of person. So I'll start with the not so well and end with the positive. I think what it hasn't done well as a field is lots of people are still unable, within the academy and and outside of the academy, they're still not able to articulate what Black studies actually is. I think people believe it's just Black history. That's kind of become a catch-all phrase. And so those of us within the field and who've been trained in the field, I think, need to do a better job at doing more public interfacing work of explaining what interdisciplinary fields are, what Black studies is, and what it does. That it's not just a kind of collection of Black people who talk about the past or use academic jargon, but to really explain what that is. Now, on the inside of it, I think what it also has not done well, as someone who was trained in this field on a master's level, I sometimes have a hard time figuring out what the research methodologies of the specific field, what are they? I know what the research methodologies are for history, but I'm not necessarily sure, outside of like what I named as the kind of positionality or the not using the kind of binary framing of either or. Like, okay, so I understand those things, but what else? And I think that there needs to be a better articulation of that. And the people who have done, at least from my cursory research, once again, kind of preparing and thinking about, preparing for this interview and thinking back to when I was in school, the people who have done, I think, the better job at trying to define those things have been the people trained in Africology or Africana, a more Afrocentric centered way of seeing themselves, in Black studies. I think they've done a much better job at defining those terms and saying these are the methodologies, right? In ways that maybe folk who are in more mainstream institutions and ways of thinking have not. Yeah. So those will probably be my two biggest critiques. I think what we've done well, to the chagrin of some, but the fact that there, I remember, it's probably been about 2 years now, but a bunch of us who work in Black studies or have been trained in Black studies all met in Washington, D.C. To present our opinions and give commentary and critiques on the creation of the African American AP exam that is sponsored by the College Board. In 1997, when I started Clark Atlanta, I would have never thought that U.S. high school students would have been presented with the option of taking an AP African American Studies course. That was incredible. And then to see all of the people there, you had the very senior people. I remember asking Nathaniel Norman, can I take a selfie with you? Having people like Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, right, who is in, not just history, but a Black Studies department at Harvard, like kind of having people who sit at these ideological oppositionary places, but all being together in the same room, for the creation of this exam. So there is a kind of mainstreaming of African American studies that has happened, which means some of the biggest complaints over the decades have been, oh man, nobody ever taught me this. I didn't know about this. It's a part of the College Board now. So it's not hidden. Yeah. It's not hidden anymore. Right? Like it's every mainstream newspaper in America, wrote about this. And so people know African American studies is a thing. So there is something about, I think, the mainstreaming and the access to African American studies that has happened that has been good. I'm not saying it's not complicated, but at least people know it exists. And it doesn't just exist for college students, but that high school students can now have access.
It's funny. I just have to say, on a personal note, you mentioned Nathaniel Normant was my oldest kid's composition teacher, and it's just strange to.
Yes,
it's really weird to have your own child taught by somebody who's like a legend in your field.
Oh my gosh, right? It's like
I was like, you better get a good grade, kid.
You better. I know. It's so funny. It's you see all of these people and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I remember reading about you when I was, kind of just starting out in grad school. So and to see them, that we were all in this, in this space. Some of the, Beverly Guy Sheftel at Spelman, one of the architects of Black feminist theory and Black womanist theory. It was just incredible to have us all gathered in that space. Yeah.
And Sharon Harley from my own.
That's right. That's right. Oh my God. Yes.
She's just right over there down the hall from where
That's
I'm
right.
talking.
Professor Harley. Tell her I said hello.
I will. Sharon,
I call her the OG. She'll know. If you say the OG, she'll know.
She is great. She's going to be on this podcast sooner than later. So, that's another thing about moving to the University of Maryland. I have to say, working with Sharon Harley and some other folks has been pretty fabulous. But you're right. I mean, it's the African American Studies being a part of the College Board. I know it's been controversial and there's been debates back and forth, but the fact that it's even present for a debate is something that we in Black Studies, I think, do need to pat ourselves on the back. Like, this is the accomplishment of generations at this point.
And once again, like you said, it's contentious still. The College Board is, it's for college-bound students, and they're, it's expensive. You have to pay for it. And, so there are all of these issues bound up, where African American studies should be accessible for everybody, outside of whether you decide to go to college or not, or whether your family can afford, for you to take these tests. But at the end of the day, people know about it, right? And I think that is important. And that students now can get access to the very things we find important and that we've devoted our professional and personal lives to.
Yeah. And I have to say that young people find really important. It's the older people getting in the way, like the older conservative people.
Yeah. It's true.
Well, I have a question, and in some ways, you really opened up a way into this question when you raised one of your hesitations around the history of Black studies and this question of methodology. Is really at the heart of this next question I want to ask you, which is, if we think about Black studies in its formation, it comes about when traditional disciplines, had done nothing close to the kind of work they ought to have been doing to represent Black life, the richness of the Black literary tradition, historical questions, sociology, just list every discipline, right?
Yeah.
So Black studies emerges out of that crisis of under or complete lack of representation.
Right. That's right.
So one of the effects of Black studies has been to change the way a lot of disciplines are composed, right? Not completely transform them, but I think we can really see the effect of Black studies in 50 plus years on disciplines, which have become more diverse in terms of the kinds of areas of study they feel like they have to represent and do represent. And I think myself, in 20 years in Black studies as a professor, we always have this crisis. English hires somebody who does African literature. It's like, that's a Black studies thing, right? And so it made me ask the question, and this is my question to you, which is, ask this, and I wrestle with it a lot, is, and this exceeds our lifetimes, unless there's some immortality drug coming, but looking forward, is the destiny of Black studies to basically erase itself, to have so transformed the disciplines that we don't need Black studies anymore? Or is Black studies something that in the decades of practice by scholars and institutionalization and debate, internal debates, Afrocentrism or something else, et cetera, has developed something distinctive about itself that cannot be replaced by disciplines being legitimately and radically transformed?
So I am going to use an answer that stems from what I said earlier. I don't necessarily think it has to be either or. It can be a little bit of both and. And by that I mean, I see Black studies as already transformative. So, I mean, on one side of it, you do have the critics who are like, I mean, why do we need Black studies when we already have these people within these quote unquote traditional disciplines who do quote unquote the Black stuff, right? So whether it's literature, or English, or poli-sci, or sociology, or, what religion, or what have you, right? And so there is something that I think that is particularly useful about Black studies, that we've trained so many people within this discipline, whether it's the master's level or the PhD level, where it's transformed fields, right? So for instance, in history, we don't have those same kind of 1990s debates around objectivity. People understand the flaws inherent in that particular way of thinking and doing history, right? It doesn't mean that you can't apply objectivity, but it's not this kind of absolute. And so we aren't having those kinds of debates anymore. And I do think that many of the studies, including Black studies, have helped helped us to not necessarily center that kind of conversation anymore, because I don't think it's as useful. And so in that sense, you can see the second part of your questions, the applicability of that. The first part of the question, though, I think, maybe, who knows? Maybe we don't need any of the studies, because in a perfect world, right, we would have a kind of balance, or as much balance as we can, to holistically think about queerness and race and sex and gender and sexuality and ethnicity and Blackness, which has become the default in this country, right? For the ways that people have subjugated and oppressed others. In my book, I talk about a kind of mapping of Blackness as the template for how other groups have been treated. And so if we are able to continue the kind of transformative work of the intellectual impact of Black studies, I think that we can have both. I'm not necessarily saying erasure is good, but perhaps it becomes just a part of the ways that we do intellectual work, where you don't necessarily have to announce it as loudly. And that I am Southern. So let me just kind of finish this with a little parable that I think is really important. When I was at Clark Atlanta, so here I was at a Black college in a Black city in the 1990s, getting a master's degree in African American studies. Back then we called it African and African American studies. And I remember there was a student from South Africa, and Clark Atlanta's African American Studies program had a very close relationship with HDIs in South Africa, or those are historically disadvantaged institutions. So for instance, Nelson Mandela graduated from an HDI in South Africa. So we would sometimes have the exchange programs, and there was a student from South Africa. And I remember, I think we were talking about, there's always like some political thing where unfortunately, Black person has been beaten by the police or whatever, right? Or some Black person has won a political race. So I can't remember what it was, but it's the late 90s, and we're talking about this thing in class. And I remember the African American men were saying, yeah, I'm so glad there's a Black person, da, da, da. And he's sitting there and he's not really contributing. And he was like, I just don't understand this whole thing about Black. And the men went off on him. I mean, there's like this back and forth. And he was like, in South Africa, I don't have to say I'm Black. Because, this is the thing. We hadn't thought about this. We lived in a country where there was this Black-white divide, and Black people are in the numerical minority. He's coming from a space where almost 90% of the population is Black. So you're not Black as much as you are Sotho or Xhosa or Zulu, or, and so for him, why are you banging on your chest about this thing that you inherently are and that doesn't necessarily define you, right? It's about the other kinds of identities that you have in this Black space. And it was the first time, I think as African Americans, because it was primarily African Americans. I don't even remember a lot of Caribbean immigrants or Caribbean Americans in the class, but largely Southern Black people. It was kind of one of the first times we were like, oh my God, we hadn't ever thought about being in a space where it's not like you live in a Black city or a Black neighborhood, but the entire country is Black.
Yeah.
And that you don't have to announce you're Black. It's like saying, I'm a Martian, and you live on Mars, and everybody else is Martian. So what is the other thing that helps to distinguish you? And so that's my way of saying perhaps we can get to that point in Black studies, right? And in the academy at large, to be like that South African man in the ways that he now thought about his identity.
Very, very interesting. You write a memoir. You've dropped a few anecdotes here, or not anecdotes, but stories that tell a really interesting story about moving inside and outside of Black studies. Well, let me ask you, and maybe it's along these lines as well. Final question: what, looking forward in the field? Because, the pandemic interrupted all the 50-year anniversary of the founding of Black Studies. So I just wanted to freeze time and say at the 50-year point, but at the 50-something year point of Black Studies, what do you think is the question we all ought to be asking or need to most urgently ask?
Oh, my goodness. What continues to be the political utility of Black studies for our world? And I think that we should not depart from that. So this is not anything new. I think it's what the founders of the field, grappled with and presented to us, and some of us have lost our way. But maybe returning to the blueprint of what is the utility? How do we continue to use our training in Black studies, the creation of new ideas and practices in Black studies to improve not just the lot of Black people, but the world? Because ultimately it's about liberation on every level, right? And so if we can continue to keep that as the guiding critical inquiry, I think we'll be okay.
Excellent. I love that. What a great note to conclude with. I really appreciate you making time for this. This has been a fantastic conversation, super interesting. It'll get ears on it, and everybody will, I think, walk away with a lot to talk about and having learned a lot. So thank you for your words and for your time. I really appreciate that.
You are welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day and take care.
Thank you. You too.